Hi guys, I hope you guys had a good weekend, and I'm going to do this quickly because I think it's going to help you guys with your paper, and I think in the end we don't have time to sort of go into the nitty-gritty details of everything about Nazi Germany, World War II, or everything, but this lecture in one way will clarify a lot of the important things that the Allies, especially the United States and Great Britain, were thinking about what Hitler meant and how we were supposed to stop him. In the end, there was no, everybody understood from very early on that Nazi Germany was going to be a threat because that wasn't surprising to begin with. But what we have to understand is that things got worse and worse and worse through the course of the 1930s. And one of the things that made it very obvious was the Spanish Civil War and how also German society was organized. So in the end, I think we'll learn how people were thinking about the Nazi threat and how that shaped the response after 1939 and in 1940 and 41. The Nazi ideology was something that functioned in a way that rejected, most importantly, something that we've been talking about in this class so far, which is that as a result of the Enlightenment, there's been two main traditions that have found a way to give people, regular people, more and more freedom in life and more freedom of expression, more freedom of movement, more freedom to live. And these two are the ideologies that fascism and the Nazis most clearly rejected. They rejected liberalism, they rejected democracy, they rejected this idea that people had the ability to speak out freely against the government, that they had the ability to talk about things and have beliefs that were outside of the concept of the state. The Nazi ideology subsumes everything to the state. The state becomes the only important thing. And this is also true about Stalin and most and totalitarian systems in general. But in this sense, the idea that you couldn't have freedom of expression, you couldn't have freedom of assembly, you couldn't do all of these things was a rejection of the liberal tradition. And much more significantly, because of the reality of what Weimar Germany was, this threat of a communist revolution that was always around the corner meant that socialism as a political and social movement was a threat to the German people, and it was something that was problematic and something that had to be dealt with. And what the Nazis came up with as a way of sort of both getting rid of the problem of not having uh, liberal values or socialist values be the way that people are going to organize society is to go through a national or racial mode of organization of society. And this idea of the Volksgemeinschaft, which literally means people's community, that if you're German, and in this sense, it doesn't matter if you're German in Germany, German in Austria, German in Czech Republic, all of these places, you are German, and your goal as a German is to be a part of the German state. So racial unity was the way forward, and national progress was going to be better than either social freedom, the ones that are, or political freedoms, the ones given by liberalism, or social freedoms, the ones that are the goal of Marxist and socialist ideology. Something that made Nazi Germany very strong, that made the government function, was this idea of the Führer principle, that Hitler was the leader of the German state, and that all power flowed from his hands. There was no separation of powers in Nazi Germany. There was no executive, no judiciary, no legislative. There was only Hitler, and Hitler was the only person that controlled all of the power of the state through the party, through the Nazi party, and then through organizations, especially things like the police. The police is very, very important. The Gestapo is very, very important as a way of the way that the Nazi system functioned. And we'll talk more about that on Wednesday when I talk about the Holocaust. Uh, Something else besides just the idea of the Nazi party and Hitler being the sort of center of the political and social constellation was the idea of Hitler himself and the cult of personality that was built around him. He was the hero of the German nation, and German propaganda sort of worked in a way to make him, greater than you could ever believe. And things like the swastika and the Sieg Heil salute and all of these things was a way of sort of creating ritualistic uh, values and ways of understanding the world that centered Hitler and the Nazi Party as sort of, integral parts of German social and cultural life. So there was no uh, way to escape it from everyday life. Your whole life was built around the Nazi Party, and you couldn't escape it. It was the only thing that was allowed to exist effectively. And on a very sort of actually material level, one of the great expressions of this is the Nazi Party rally grounds in Nuremberg, which was built just to have Nazi Party rallies. And the picture you're seeing is from one of those rallies. And you can see how spectacular this thing is. And if you look, one of the things that makes it very clear was that the Nazis built buildings that were incredible and sort of very monumental and hard to sort of ignore. You couldn't ignore the power of the Nazi Party because of even the way that the built environment around Germany was changed by the Nazis and Hitler and his chief architect Albert Speer. They were sort of like the architects, literally in the sense of a new Germany, even from the ground up with buildings. The totalitarian state that coalesced itself around Hitler in 1933, 1934, 1935 was had to get rid of all of the possible resistance that you could possibly have. And this is the reason why things like the KPD, German Communist Party, and the labor unions, and liberal groups, and the uh, Catholic priests, and anybody, pretty much anybody that had the guts to stand up to Hitler, was very quickly arrested or killed, or there was concentration camps like Dachau. Dachau and Buchenwald were concentration camps that were around from the very beginning, and those were used primarily against what we would call political prisoners that the Nazi Party and the German state uh, had to deal with those enemies, what they saw as enemies, and they would saw sort of like no problem in imprisoning them and killing them and all these things. Something else about German society, which I kind of mentioned earlier, was that the Nazi Party had a total uh, monopoly on on civil society. There was nothing that could exist in Nazi Germany that wasn't somehow subordinated to the Nazi cause. So anything that you can imagine, the churches, the schools, the German automobile club, these women's leagues, the Hitler Youth, which used to be, they took over the Boy Scouts, everything, things that you would think could exist outside of the state were completely subsumed by the Nazi Party. So there was no way for people to sort of build oppositions to Nazism on the basis of civil society. They had to do it in secret. That was the only way you could do it. And 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 so flowing from that, if you have control of civil society organizations, you also have to have control of the media, the newspapers, the magazines, the movies, the radio. And by this time, by the 1930s, the movies and the radio were a part of life in German society, Western Europe, and North America and the more advanced parts of the world. So the Nazi Party had this ability to use these new methods of communication as a way of doing their propaganda. So in a way, they already were building from the very beginning a state that was based on the use of mass media as a way of building uh, this Volksgemeinschaft, this national unit that ignored class tensions in favor of something like uh, national racial purity and national unity for the future of the German race. And so the classic example of sort of the reaction of European intellectuals to the rise of the Nazi Party in the 1930s is kind of is shown itself in the Spanish Civil War, because Franco was not a, a Nazi, but the Nazi Party supported uh, the Franco regime, and so did the Italians. So people, and especially socialist intellectuals, and the Soviet Union specifically, through the use of the Comintern, said that our duty is to stop fascism wherever we can stop it. And they came up with this idea of uh, the United Front. The United Front was an idea that everybody that was opposed to fascism, it doesn't matter if you're a communist, a social democrat, or from the liberal bourgeois parties, everybody has the duty to oppose fascism. And this is actually came to be in the Spanish Civil War, where people from all over the world, but especially from these countries like Britain and France the Soviet Union and the United States came to Spain to fight against Franco and the nationalists. So there was sort of a proxy war going on in the Spanish Civil War between the nationalists, who were supported by Nazi Germany and fascist Italy, and the Republicans, who was a bunch of different kinds of people. There were anarchists. George Orwell was one of the anarchists that were there, communists, social democrats, liberals that were there to stop the Nazis, but that, to stop the rise of fascism. But that's the important thing, is that they understood that fascism was something that could only be stopped by force. And they understood that the future of Spain specifically, and the future of Europe more generally, kind of depended on people using force to stop fascism. And if you look at sort of the way that this functioned, was that they thought that uh, fascism was there to destroy everything, that all of the gains that free people, have made through the course of the 19th and the early part of the 20th century. So both the liberal freedoms, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, and sort of like the more Marxist values of sort of having the right to organize, labor unions, and the idea that people had sort of the right to education and more social freedom, sort of like the welfare state, that, the Nazis were there to sort of stifle the possibility for growth of something like a welfare state. And more broadly, socialist political and social movements all around the world, and especially in Europe. And Pablo Picasso, he painted Guernica as sort of like a painting that describes the horrors of war broadly, but the horrors of fascism specifically, because he was because this was one of the sort of biggest, most dramatic events of the Spanish Civil War, which is when the nationalists bombed the city of Guernica. And this was still something that wasn't very common at the time, because like I said, they did it in Ethiopia and stuff. But Europeans bombing other Europeans kind of shows that that the fascists had chosen barbarity, and sort of they didn't care about humanity. They only cared about power. And that's always something that becomes very important, that the fascists don't care about human life. They only care about power, and they only care about making themselves bigger and more powerful. So, in September of 1939, Hitler invaded Poland. And as a response to Hitler invading Poland, both France and Britain declared war on Germany. And they did it because they were saying, we are the ones that have to stop Hitler's rise to power. This is our only choice in stopping his rise to power. And from the German takeover of Poland until May of 1940, nothing much happened. War in the war itself. The war kind of stopped for a while. People call it the phony war. Some historians call it the phony war. And in the spring of 1940, uh, Hitler decided that he was going to take over Western Europe. And it's amazing how easy he did it in Denmark and Norway. Denmark and Norway fell very quickly. He invaded the Netherlands, they invaded Belgium, and then the Battle of France. And the French, unsurprisingly, as we've learned from every time that they face a German army since 1870, It kind of doesn't go very well. And the French and the Nazis took Paris in like 6 weeks. By like June of 1940, they had taken Paris. So there was no Hitler had taken all of Western Europe. Uh, if you've ever seen that movie Dunkirk, this is what I'm talking about, where the British forces have to go back to England because we're trying to save the troops of the British Expeditionary Force. And so the British Expeditionary Force leaves Europe, and Hitler is basically in total control of the continent, of Western Europe, of the lands that he already took, his Italian allies, and so things are looking really, really bad. And then from, in the second half of 1940, Germany starts bombing Britain, when what they call the Battle of Britain slash the Blitz. And that if Britain falls out of the war with its big, massive empire, there was no way that anybody could possibly stop fascism or Nazi Germany from possibly taking over the world. But what? But FDR, even though the United States was neutral, it wasn't in the war. But from like since the late 1930s, FDR was already committed to helping people that were opposed to uh, to Imperial Japan and Nazi Germany. And one of this is, and the great example of this was that even though the United States was neutral, there was this policy that if the United States wouldn't use its own ships to sell military material to other countries, but you could cash and carry, you could pay and you could take your own stuff, but you had to use your own ships to buy and take the stuff. And Lend-Lease was this deal that FDR made with British that basically says we'll give you the stuff you need as long as you give it back. And also if you give us some military bases. This is how we got the British Virgin Islands. The British pretty much paid for a bunch of military stuff that they needed through just giving us things like the British Virgin Islands. So it was a good deal for both sides, and we didn't want the Nazis to win. So FDR was always going to, most likely always going to help the British against the Nazis because he was never going to let the Nazis win. Uh, Something else with this is the speech that you're actually analyzing, which is that, you know, FDR understood that the United States was probably already the biggest industrial power in the world, and that we were the last hope for the Allies beating the Germans. So we actually had to be what made it possible for the British to keep on fighting. And if you read the speech, this is what comes across, that, the Allies were fighting this awful dark powers of the Nazis, and we had a duty as civilized people to stop the rise of the Nazi Party. And how that works was through mainly political matters. That we can make deals and alliances, and we can try and create a world that was opposed to fascism through political means more than anything else. And this is what's important, is that FDR was a believer in the liberal world order, just like Woodrow Wilson in the 14 points was sort of like the founding document of the liberal world order in the 20th century, FDR was a follower of that sort of Wilsonian uh, mantra of liberal internationalism. And the great example of this liberal international way of thinking and sort of the not what the British and the Americans came to realize when they joined together at the Atlantic Charter. And you can read the Atlantic Charter on Canvas. It's one of your primary sources. That we have to fight together to protect the liberal world order. This idea of freedom of the seas and national self-determination and rejection of wars, of national aggrandizement, of national expansion, and all of these things in favor of using means of more sort of cooperative means to settle our problems, which is where something like the League of Nations failed, even though it was already falling apart. Churchill and Hitler were already thinking forward towards the United Nations as a way of getting rid of war as a problem. So, and then things like the World Bank, the IMF, the sort of Bretton Woods system kind of had its origins here as a way of saying that we've gone through this depression, we've gone through this rise of fascism in Europe and fascism in Japan, and we have to have organizations that kind of guarantee freedom for nations to do things together in a liberal way. And this is different from what Wallace is saying, that ultimately why the United States and what he calls the United Nations, he even calls them the United Nations in his speech, was that we're trying to fight Nazism so that more and more people can have more and more freedom. And that freedom, in the sense, is the freedom to organize together into labor unions, the freedom to uh, have better education, to learn, to sort of for human improvement. So, uh, FDR's point is that the war was being fought to save liberal democracy. And Henry Wallace was trying to say that the war was fought to try and save the ability of people to organize together and gain more and more freedom from the state and for the improvement of mankind broadly, not just for the powerful countries. And I'll see you guys on Wednesday.